In the winter of 1387, in the frozen heart of the Frostfang Mountains, a 19-year-old exile named Elira Duskwood pulled 11 massive wolves from the shattered ice of the Scarrow River, one after another, with nothing but a hemp rope, a bone-handled dagger, and hands blistered raw from the cold. And she had no idea that the 12th wolf she dragged onto the frozen bank that dawn, half-drowned and bleeding silver into the snow, was Draven Ashkalo, Alpha King of the Ashkalo Pack. Comment where you're watching from. If you've ever pulled someone back from the edge of something they couldn't survive alone, then like and subscribe before the ice cracks wide open again. 3 things happened before the sun cleared the ridgeline that morning, and none of them made sense until much later. First, the river gave up a wound that should have killed a grown man 3 times over. A gash across the 12th wolf's ribs, packed with something that hissed and smoked where the current touched it. A silver-forged arrowhead broken off deep in the muscle, still bleeding a thin line of poison the color of tarnished coin. Second, half a mile downriver, in the shadow of the old watchtower, Commander Bastian Vorn stood counting arrows that would not add up to the number he'd loosed the night before, and he said the words he would repeat for weeks afterward, without knowing they were already a countdown, that the exile girl who lived alone past the tree line was nothing but a broken little bird, too soft to matter, too small to notice. Third, in the war room of Ashkalo Hold, 40 miles east, Lord Cassian Rothmere, regent, uncle to the missing king, a man with ink-stained fingers, and a ledger open to a page of numbers no one else had seen, smiled at a raven that had not yet returned, because a king lost in the Scarrow River in midwinter was to him a king already dead, and dead kings left their crowns to whoever had signed the fewest documents proving otherwise. Elira didn't know any of that. She only knew the weight in her arms and the 11 wolves already breathing in ragged circles around her cabin, and a 12th one dying under her hands with a wound that shouldn't have existed on any ordinary beast, because ordinary wounds didn't fight back. Elira Duskwood had been the daughter of Roderin Duskwood, hunter-healer to the old Ashkalo court, until the night 11 years earlier when he was killed defending a hunting party that included a boy who would grow up to forget his name. She was 6 when the pack elders decided a dead man's daughter was worth nothing without her father's rank attached to her, and she was 7 when they moved her and her mother past the tree line, into the exile houses where humans and cast-off wolves lived on the edges of Ashkalo land, tolerated but never counted. Her mother died of a fever 3 winters later. Elira stayed. She learned to set snares before she learned to read, learned the names of 41 poisonous roots before she learned her letters, because her father's healing satchel was the only inheritance the elders hadn't thought worth confiscating, and inside it, pressed between waxed paper, were his notes on wolfsbane, silverbane, nightbloom root, and the 17 ways a body could die slowly enough for someone to notice and stop it, if they knew what to look for. By 19, she was exactly what Commander Vorn called her, without ever having spoken to her. A rumor at the edge of Ashkalo territory, a girl who lived alone in a cabin, built from her father's old hunting lodge, who traded cured pelts and healing salves at the winter market, and said almost nothing while she did it. What Vorn did not know, because no one had bothered to ask, was that she could field dress a bear in under 6 minutes, that she had killed a rabid wolf twice her size with a single thrust to the base of the skull at age 14, and that she had spent every night since her father's death rereading the same 4 pages of his satchel notes on silver poisoning until the ink had worn soft under her thumb. She was not fragile. She had simply never been given a reason to prove otherwise in front of anyone who mattered. The 12th wolf on her frozen riverbank was 7 feet at the shoulder in his shifted beast form, black-furred with a single streak of pale gray running from his left ear to his jaw, and when Elira knelt beside him in the snow, she saw the wound clearly for the first time, an arrowhead forged of pure silver, not the silver alloy hunters used for ordinary predators, but a denser, colder metal that only royal armories kept in locked vaults, because pure silver against a wolf's bloodstream didn't wound, it poisoned, spreading through the muscle in threads of gray-black rot unless it was drawn and countered within hours. She had seen the pattern once before, in her father's notes, in his own handwriting, 3 lines describing a poison called silverbane, and a single cramped sentence in the margin that read, "This is not a hunter's weapon, this is an assassin's." She worked through the morning without stopping to ask who he was. The other 11 wolves, pack scouts, she realized later, sent out at Vorn's mercenary company's approach and caught in the same river ambush, lay recovering around the cabin, too weak from cold shock to shift back or speak, watching with amber and gold eyes as she cut away fur and skin to reach the arrowhead buried 3 inches deep against the 12th wolf's 5th rib. She packed the wound with crushed nightbloom root, a pale flower that grew only in the shadowed hollows above the Scarrow River and smelled faintly of burnt sugar when bruised, the only known counter to silverbane, according to her father's notes, and even then, only if applied before the poison reached the heart. She measured it by instinct, 3 fingers worth ground into paste, pressed directly into the wound, then bound with strips of her own spare shirt because she had no bandages left after the first 11 wolves. The black-furred wolf's breathing steadied within the hour. His eyes opened once. Pale gold shot through, with a thin ring of red at the edges. The color, she would learn, that Ashkelon wolves' eyes turned only when they were fighting to hold their beast form back from rage or death, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause with her hands still on his ribs. He didn't shift back to speak. He couldn't. Not yet. Not with that much silver still working through his blood, even with the nightbloom slowing it. But he pressed his muzzle, once, against the inside of her wrist. Not a bite, not a warning, something closer to a soldier's salute, before his eyes closed again, and his breathing evened into real sleep instead of the shallow, poisoned kind. Elira sat back on her heels in the snow, blood and nightbloom paste drying on her hands, and did not yet know that the wolf sleeping against her cabin wall was a king, or that the arrowhead she'd just pulled from his ribs and dropped into a jar for later study had been forged 11 days earlier in a private smithy Lord Cassian Rothmere had commissioned under a false name, or that somewhere on the ridge above the river, a mercenary captain named Bastian Vorn was already riding back toward Ashkelon Hold to report a job half-finished. 11 wolves escaped, and the 12th unaccounted for, presumed dead in the current, which was, as far as Vorn was concerned, close enough to collect payment on. The 11 wolves shifted back to their human forms by midday, and the eldest among them, a broad-shouldered scout named Fenrir Draug, silver-scarred across one forearm from an old border skirmish, was the first to understand exactly what he was looking at when he saw the black wolf breathing steady against Elira's cabin wall. He went very still. Then he asked her, carefully, whether she knew whose life she'd just saved, and when she said she didn't, and didn't especially care, because a dying man was a dying man whether he wore a crown or not. Fenrir laughed for the first time, in what he said later had been 11 days, and told her that the man she'd just packed full of nightbloom root and bound in her own shirt was Draven Ashkelon, Alpha King of the Ashkelon Pack, missing for 11 days, and presumed drowned by everyone from his own war council down to the mercenary company his uncle had hired to make sure the presumption held. If you've made it this far, you already know what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who never bothered to look twice. So tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Hit like before the next log breaks in the fire, and subscribe now, because the girl who just saved a king doesn't even know yet how many people want him to stay dead. Draven woke fully on the 3rd day, human-formed and weak but lucid, in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faint burnt sugar trace of nightbloom root still lingering in his bandages. He was 6'4", with a build shaped by a decade of border warfare, black hair cropped close, a jagged scar running from his collarbone to the base of his throat from a fight he'd won at 19, and eyes that shifted color with his mood, the way every full alphas did, pale gold when calm, deepening toward amber when focused, and that same thin ring of blood red at the edges when his control over the beast slipped. He looked at Elira across the small cabin, at the girl in a patched wool dress, who'd apparently spent 3 days changing his dressings and forcing broth down his throat, while 11 of his own scouts stood guard outside her door like she was the one who outranked them, and his first instinct, the one he'd admit later he was ashamed of, was to assume she was some healer's apprentice, sent by a nearby village, someone who needed protecting, rather than someone who'd already done the protecting. He tried to stand within the hour to prove he didn't need it. He collapsed within 4 steps, and Alira caught him under one arm with a strength that stopped being surprising, only because she'd already caught heavier men than him falling off riverbanks. "You'll tear the wound open again," she told him, flat and unbothered, guiding him back down onto the cot without any of the reverence his own court would have shown him. "Sit still. I didn't spend 3 days keeping the silver out of your heart so you could finish the job yourself." He stared at her, not with anger, but with the particular disorientation of a king who had never once, in 29 years, been spoken to like a patient instead of a sovereign. It was the first crack in the condescension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. It would not be the last. Fenrir Draug became her shadow within the week, half out of gratitude and half out of the old instinct of a second-in-command who recognized competence when he saw it. He was the one who told her, quietly, one evening while Draven slept off the last of the poison, that he'd fought beside men twice her size who couldn't have stitched that wound half as clean, and that the pack owed her a debt most of them would spend years pretending they didn't. He was 34, broad and steady, where Draven was sharp and coiled, and he became, without either of them naming it, the person who explained to Alira exactly how much danger she'd stepped into by saving a king that half his own court had already started dividing up for parts. That danger arrived formally 11 days later, when a company of 20 mounted riders under Bastian Vorn's banner came up the river road toward the exile houses, ostensibly searching the tree line for any sign of the missing king's body, in truth, searching for confirmation that he hadn't survived. Vorn was 31, lean and scarred across one eyebrow, a mercenary captain who'd built his reputation on being cheaper and more thorough than the Ashkallow Pack's own trackers, and when he found Alira's cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, 11 sets of boot prints in the snow that didn't belong to any exile household, he didn't find the king, because Fenrir had already moved Draven to a hidden ice cave 2 miles upriver at the first sign of riders. What Vorn found instead was Alira alone at her woodpile, and he made the mistake, in front of his own men, of deciding she knew more than she was telling him and could be made to talk the easy way. "Where's the pack's precious lost king, little bird?" he said, close enough that she could smell the leather and horse sweat on him, close enough to see the smirk settle into the scar above his eyebrow. "You're a broken little thing to be hiding anyone. Fragile little bird playing house past the tree line. Tell me what you know before I decide you're not worth the trouble of asking twice." She didn't answer with words. She answered by driving the flat of her boot into the side of his knee hard enough to buckle it, stepping past him before his balance recovered, and holding the point of her father's dagger a half-inch from the artery in his throat before a single rider could dismount. "I've gutted bears for less provocation than a man breathing on my neck," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "And the only thing broken here is about to be your kneecap if you don't step back." Vorn stepped back. He rode away with his knee already swelling and his report to Rothmir carefully edited to leave out exactly how a 19-year-old exile had put him on the ground in front of his own company. But the humiliation followed him back to Ashkallow Hold and into every conversation he had with Rothmir for the next 3 weeks, because a man like Vorn could survive almost anything except being made small in front of witnesses. Lord Cassian Rothmir received Vorn's report in the war room at Ashkallow Hold, with the same ink-stained calm he brought to everything, turning a silver coin over his knuckles while he listened. And when Vorn finished, leaving out the kneecap, mentioning only that the exile girl was uncooperative, Rothmir set the coin down and said the thing he would repeat to 3 different people over the following weeks, each time with the same thin, patient smile, that the girl was a complication, nothing more, a loose thread from a dead hunter's bloodline that should have been swept past the tree line and forgotten 11 years ago, and complications, in his experience, were only ever solved one way. He was 46, silver-templed, precise in a way that made him look harmless, in rooms full of warriors twice his size, and he had spent 11 years as regent, building the exact kind of quiet, patient loyalty among the Ashkallow Council that made it easy for no one to ask why the silver arrows used against his own nephew's scouting party had been forged in a smithy that didn't appear on any registered guild ledger. "Find the girl," he told Vorn, "and find out what she knows about Nightbloom Root, because a healer's daughter who can counter Silverbane on instinct is not a complication I intend to leave breathing." The second warning came from inside her own walls, and it hurt worse for it. Wren Ashwood, a 16-year-old exile girl Elira had half-raised since Wren's mother died of the same fever that had taken her own, had been quietly feeding information to one of Rothmir's stewards for 2 months, in exchange for coin and the promise of a name struck off the exile registry. Small things at first, market gossip, then the location of Elira's cabin, then, the week after Vorn's visit, confirmation that 11 wolves had been seen near the cabin and hadn't left. Wren told herself it was survival. She told herself Elira, of all people, would understand what it meant to do whatever it took to stop being counted as nothing. She did not yet understand that the information she'd sold would be the reason 20 of Rothmir's private guard rode for the ice cave 2 miles upriver 3 days later, before Draven had fully healed, before Fenrir had finished training the 6 scouts he'd started quietly gathering into something like a real defense. By then, Draven and Elira had settled into something neither of them named out loud. He healed fully in 18 days, and in that time, he watched her identify 7 different poisons by smell alone, watched her reset Fenrir's dislocated shoulder without flinching, while 3 grown wolves flinched for her, watched her ration her own food to make sure the pack scouts recovering in her care ate first, and the condescension he'd carried into that cabin burned away piece by piece, until what replaced it wasn't gratitude, it was something closer to reverence, the kind he'd never once felt for the noble-born healers his own court kept on retainer. He told her, on the 16th night, sitting outside the cabin under a sky so cold the stars looked sharpened, that his eyes had turned red twice in the last decade, once when his father died, once when he watched 3 of his scouts drown in a river crossing he'd ordered, and that they hadn't turned red once since the morning she pulled him out of the scarrow, which he took, he said, as proof that some part of him had recognized safety before the rest of him caught up. She didn't answer with a declaration. She answered by telling him, flatly, that she'd pulled 11 other wolves out of that river before him, and hadn't felt a thing, and that whatever he was building in his head about fate and rivers, he could keep it to himself until he'd earned the right to say it to her face as a king instead of a patient. He laughed, the first real laugh she'd heard from him, and told her he intended to earn exactly that, publicly, in front of every wolf who'd ever called her father's daughter worth nothing. The Nightbloom root itself became the first hard piece of the mechanism she would need later. She'd pressed a dried sprig of it, along with the silver arrowhead she'd pulled from his ribs, into a small tin box her father had once used for his own field samples, and she kept it beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, not out of foresight, but out of the same instinct that made her keep every poison sample she'd ever extracted, in case the pattern ever repeated. It would repeat. The arrowhead's maker's mark, a small stamped rune shaped like a broken wheel, matched nothing in any registered Ashcallow smithy, a detail Fenrir noticed on the 19th day, turning the arrowhead over in the firelight, with the particular stillness of a soldier realizing a war had already started without him. The raid came at dawn on the 22nd day, 20 of Rothmir's private guard, under a captain loyal only to the regent's coin, moving fast through the tree line, because Wren had given them the one detail Vorn's company never had. The exact hour, the 6 trained scouts rotated their watch, leaving a 4-minute gap in the perimeter. Fenrir caught the first rider's approach with 11 seconds to spare, enough to get Draven armed but not enough to get Elira clear, and when the guard captain broke through the cabin door, it was Elira who put a hunting arrow through his shoulder before he crossed the threshold. Elira, who stood between Draven and a second attacker, with her father's dagger already slick, moving with the same cold economy she'd used to strip an arrowhead from a dying king's ribs 3 weeks earlier. The fight lasted 6 minutes. It ended with 4 of Rothmir's guard dead. The rest fled toward Ashcallow Hold, and Wren standing frozen at the tree line where she'd led them, close enough to see Elira's face, when she understood whose information had nearly gotten everyone in that cabin killed. Elira didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at Wren across 20 feet of trampled snow, at the girl she'd fed and half-raised for 4 years, and she said only, "How much?" in a voice so level it frightened Fenrir more than the fight had. Wren's answer came in pieces. Coin, a promised name off the registry, 2 months of small betrayals that had felt, each time, too small to matter until they added up to a raid that had nearly killed a king. Draven, standing bloodied in the cabin doorway, watched Elira absorb the second wound of the morning without a single crack showing on the surface, and understood, watching her, exactly what Fenrir had meant weeks earlier about the pack owing her a debt most of them would spend years pretending they didn't. He didn't order Ren's death. He ordered her held, under guard, until the larger truth of who'd sent that raid could be dragged fully into the light. Because Ren, however she'd betrayed them, was a symptom, and Rothmir was the disease. The arrowhead's broken wheelmaker's mark gave them the rest. Fenrir recognized it 3 days later, comparing it against an old guild ledger smuggled out of Ashkallow Hold by a kitchen steward still loyal to the crown. The mark belonged to a smithy in the lower valley that had operated under a false registration for exactly 11 months, paid for, according to the ledger's hidden second set of entries, by a signature Fenrir knew on sight, because he'd watched Rothmir sign it 1,000 times on council documents. The proof was there in ink, a private commission for 40 pure silver arrowheads, dated 12 days before the scouting party's river ambush, paid from a personal account Rothmir had never once declared to the War Council. Combined with the Nightbloom-stained arrowhead itself, still sealed in Elira's father's tin box, and Ren's confession naming the steward, who'd relayed her information up the chain to Rothmir's household, the mechanism was complete, not a suspicion anymore, but a case that could be laid, piece by piece, in front of the full Ashkallow Council and survive scrutiny. Draven called for a formal reckoning at the Hold's central courtyard, the same stone circle where every major pack matter had been settled for 6 generations, and set it for the 30th day since the river. Enough time, he told Fenrir, for word to spread through every corner of Ashkallow territory that the missing king had returned alive, and enough time for Rothmir to either flee or, more likely, given 11 years of practiced confidence, stay and gamble that no one would believe an exile's evidence over a regent's word. Rothmir stayed. He miscalculated, the way men who have never been challenged usually do, and he sent Bastian Vorn ahead to the courtyard 3 days early, with instructions to discredit the girl publicly before she ever got the chance to speak, because a rumor of madness or vengeance, planted early enough, could poison a courtroom faster than any silver arrow. Vorn found Elira the night before the reckoning, alone at the edge of the courtyard grounds checking the seals on the tin box one last time, and he tried one final time to make her small, because it was the only weapon he had left. Tomorrow the whole pack watches a broken little bird try to accuse a regent of treason with nothing but a rusted arrowhead and a servant girl's guilty conscience, he told her, close enough again that she could smell the same leather and horse sweat, though this time his hand hovered near his sword hilt instead of near her face. You'll be laughed out of that courtyard before midday, fragile little bird, and then we'll see how brave you are without 20 wolves standing behind you. Elira didn't step back this time either. She looked at him the way she'd once looked at a rabid wolf twice her size, and told him that she'd already survived losing her father, her mother, her rank, and her home, and that a mercenary's insults were the least frightening thing that had happened to her in 11 years. Then she walked past him toward the hold without waiting for a response, because she'd learned by then that men like Vorn only ever grew louder when you gave them the satisfaction of a reply. That night, Draven found her checking the evidence a second time by candlelight, and for the first time since the river, she let something crack in front of him. Not fear of the courtroom, she told him, but fear that even airtight proof wouldn't matter against 11 years of Rothmir's careful reputation, that the council would choose comfort over truth, the way councils so often did. Draven took her hand, the tin box still open between them, and told her that whatever the council chose tomorrow, he had already chosen, and that he intended to say so publicly, in front of every wolf who'd ever doubted her, whether the council agreed with him or not. It wasn't a proposal. It was a declaration, plain and unpolished, the kind a king only makes once he's stopped performing for an audience and started meaning every word. And Elira, who had spent 11 years being careful with every emotion she let show, let herself, for one quiet hour before dawn, simply believe him. The courtyard filled past capacity by midday. Close to 400 Ashkallow wolves and human vassals ringed 3 deep around the stone circle, and Rothmir presided from the council dais with the same thin smile he'd worn for 11 years, confident enough in his own reputation that he let Elira speak first, certain the courtyard would dismiss her before she finished. She didn't raise her voice. She laid the arrowhead on the stone floor of the circle, described the silverbane poisoning in the exact clinical detail her father had taught her, then laid the smuggled ledger page beside it, and finally called Wren forward, shaking, guarded, but present, to confirm under oath whose coin had bought her betrayal and whose steward had carried the information up the chain. Rothmere laughed once, dismissively, and said the courtyard shouldn't weigh an exile's testimony and a traitor's confession over a regent's 11 years of service, and it was Bastian Vorn, sensing which way the wind was already turning and desperate to distance himself from a losing side, who made the final mistake. He stepped forward to discredit her one more time, called her, in front of the full courtyard, a fragile little bird playing at justice, and it was Fenrir, standing at Draven's shoulder, who answered him loud enough for all 400 witnesses to hear that she was never broken, she was never fragile, she had never once in her life been anything but strength wearing a quiet face, and any man who'd needed a raid, a poisoning, and 11 years of buried ledgers to finally understand that had no business calling anyone else weak. Draven stepped into the circle then, eyes shading from gold toward amber but never once toward red, and named Rothmere before the full council in the old formal words the hold hadn't heard invoked in 3 generations: treason against the crown, conspiracy to assassinate a sitting Alpha King, and the ordering of an unlawful raid against a citizen under royal protection. The council, 40 elders who had spent 11 years accepting Rothmere's quiet competence without ever testing it, voted in under an hour. And the vote wasn't close. Rothmere didn't run. He went very still, the ink-stained calm finally cracking, and asked only, before the guards took him, how a dead hunter's daughter had outmaneuvered 11 years of careful work in 30 days. Elira didn't answer. She'd already said everything that needed saying, and some silences spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Bastian Vorn's mercenary contract was voided within the hour, his company stripped of Ashkelon patronage and banished from the territory before nightfall, his own men refusing to meet his eyes as they rode out, because a captain who calls a woman fragile in front of 400 witnesses and then loses to her doesn't keep loyal soldiers for long. Wren was not executed. Elira asked for that mercy herself, quietly, telling the council that a 16-year-old who'd been starving and desperate for a name off the exile registry was not the same shape of betrayal as a regent who'd poisoned his own nephew for a crown, but she was exiled from Ashkelon lands entirely, stripped of the tin box of coin she'd been paid with, and sent south, with a warning that the mercy shown today would not be offered twice. 3 weeks later, at the same stone circle, Draven crowned Elira Duskwood as Luna of Ashkelon, before the same 400 witnesses who had once called her nothing, placing her father's old dagger across her palms alongside the crown itself, because some inheritances, he said, deserved to be worn together. Fenrir stood at her right as her sworn first guard, the way he'd stood at her cabin door on the very first morning. She didn't cry at the coronation either. She simply thought of 11 wolves pulled one by one from a frozen river, and a 12th she hadn't known was a king, and understood, finally, that the world had spent 11 years teaching her she was worth nothing, precisely because it had always known exactly how much she was worth. How many people in your own life have underestimated you long before they ever gave you the chance to prove them wrong? Somewhere south of the border that same week, an exiled 16-year-old with an empty coin purse knocked on a stranger's door and found out exactly how far Rothmere's old contacts still reached. But that's the next video, and you already know what happens to people who ignore a warning the first time. Subscribe now. You've already sat through the whole reckoning, you might as well see how it finishes.